The invitation alone probably cost more than my entire farmhouse. That was the first thing I thought as I stepped through the enormous glass entrance of the luxury resort orbiting above New Terra. Crystal lights floated beneath the ceiling, expensive music drifted through the ballroom, and hundreds of perfectly dressed guests moved around like they were attending a royal coronation instead of a wedding. Then my brother spotted me. "Well, look who finally left the cornfields." Several relatives laughed immediately. I smiled. "Good to see you too." My older brother adjusted his designer jacket and looked me up and down. "You couldn't at least buy a new suit? This one still works. That explains why you're still poor." More laughter. Nothing unusual there. For nearly 10 years my family had treated me like the joke of every gathering. While my brother became a corporate executive, and my cousins chased high-paying careers across the galaxy, I bought a neglected piece of farmland on the edge of civilization. According to my family, that was proof I had permanently lost my mind. Never mind the fact that the farm was growing every year. Never mind the thousands of acres I managed. Never mind the communities my crops supplied. To them, I was still the dirt-poor farmer. An aunt appeared beside me holding a glass of expensive champagne. "Oh dear, are those real work boots?" "They are." "How adorable. It's like he came straight from the barn." Several guests chuckled. I looked down at my boots. They were clean. Mostly. Before I could answer, someone else approached. The bride's family. They were wealthy even by interstellar standards. Their jewelry alone could probably purchase 3 farms. One of the bride's uncles shook my hand. "So you're the farmer we've heard so much about." I nodded. "Must be tough competing with weather for promotions." The surrounding group burst into laughter. I laughed too. That confused them. People expected anger. When they didn't get it, they usually became disappointed. Across the room I noticed someone watching the exchange. A tall alien woman stood beside the bridal party. Unlike the others, she wasn't laughing. She actually looked annoyed. A few minutes later, while I was grabbing a drink, she approached. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," she said, "but your family seems unusually proud of being rude." I nearly choked on my drink. That was the most honest thing anyone had said all evening. "You get used to it." "That sounds depressing." "It saves time." For the first time all night, somebody laughed with me instead of at me. She introduced herself as the bride's closest friend and maid of honor. Her species came from a world famous for agricultural engineering and ecological restoration. Ironically, her people considered food producers among the most respected members of society. When I told her I owned a farm, her eyes lit up. "A real one?" "Last time I checked." "What do you grow?" I spent several minutes explaining my crops, livestock programs, and restoration projects. Unlike everyone else, she seemed genuinely fascinated. She asked questions. Lots of questions. Actual questions. Not jokes disguised as questions. For once, I didn't feel like the entertainment. Meanwhile, my relatives kept staring. The more she talked to me, the more confused they became. Why would someone beautiful, intelligent, and sophisticated spend time talking to the family failure? My cousin eventually wandered over. "Careful," he told her. "If he starts talking about fertilizer, you'll never escape." She smiled. "That sounds far more interesting than listening to stock market stories." I had to look away to hide my grin. My cousin did not appreciate the response. As the evening continued, the teasing only increased. Apparently my family couldn't tolerate seeing me enjoy myself. Every joke became slightly louder. Every comment became slightly sharper. Yet the alien woman stayed beside me through most of it. And for the first time in years, I found myself actually enjoying a family event. Unfortunately, my brother noticed. That was never a good sign. Late in the evening he climbed onto the reception stage and grabbed a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "later tonight my little brother will be giving a wedding toast." A wave of laughter rolled through the room. I immediately knew what he was doing. He expected me to embarrass myself. The guest expected entertainment. My family expected another joke. I simply raised my glass. Happy to. The confidence in my voice caused several smiles to disappear. And somewhere across the ballroom, the maid of honor smiled as if she knew something the rest of them didn't. For the first time that night, I wasn't nervous about speaking. I was looking forward to it. The reception somehow became even more expensive after dinner. I didn't know that was possible. Floating musicians appeared above the dance floor. Holographic fireworks exploded across the ceiling. Tiny service drones carried trays of food worth more than my first tractor. Everywhere I looked, people were competing to prove who had the most money. One cousin spent 15 minutes explaining his luxury penthouse on a resort moon. Another relative bragged about owning 3 private spacecraft. A third wouldn't stop mentioning his investment portfolio. Nobody asked about crops. Nobody asked about food production. Apparently people enjoyed eating, but discussing where food came from was beneath them. I was quietly working on a dessert when my uncle sat beside me. "So tell me," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "How many carrots does a farmer have to sell to afford a wedding like this?" Several guests laughed. I took a bite of cake. "Probably more than I can count." The table laughed again. My uncle looked disappointed that I hadn't been offended. Across the room, the maid of honor was speaking with members of the bridal party. Every few minutes, however, I noticed her glancing toward my table. Eventually she escaped the crowd and joined me. "Are they always like this?" she asked. "You mean wealthy?" I was going to say exhausting. That earned a genuine laugh from me. She smiled. For some reason, that smile hit harder than any insult my family had thrown all evening. We spent the next half hour talking while the reception continued around us. She asked about life on the frontier. I told her about rebuilding damaged soil, restoring abandoned ecosystems, and helping small settlements become self-sufficient. Instead of looking bored, she seemed fascinated. "On my world," she said, "people who can create life from barren ground are highly respected. Your world sounds nicer than mine. It has fewer investment bankers." "That definitely sounds nicer." She laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. The conversation became easier after that. Natural. Comfortable. For the first time all evening, I forgot I was at my brother's wedding. Then my family noticed. My cousin approached first. "Wow," he said. "I didn't know farmers had enough free time to flirt." The maid of honor raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be funny?" "It was supposed to be." "Then I regret to inform you that it failed." Several nearby guests snorted with laughter. My cousin retreated immediately. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it encouraged others. One relative asked if I had arrived on a tractor. Another wanted to know whether my wedding gift consisted of potatoes. A third wondered if my farm still used electricity. The jokes became increasingly ridiculous. Unfortunately for them, the maid of honor seemed to enjoy destroying every insult. "If farmers disappeared," she pointed out during one conversation, "most of you would starve within a month." Nobody had a response. A few minutes later she leaned closer. "You know, your family is very strange. That's one word for it. They treat success as if it only exists in office buildings." I nodded. She understood immediately. That was rare. Most people saw dirt and assumed failure. She saw the years of work behind it. The longer we talked, the more obvious our connection became. Unfortunately, it also became obvious to everyone else. I noticed several jealous looks from wealthy guests who had spent hours trying to impress her. Apparently, stories about restoring ecosystems were beating luxury yachts. That realization seemed to upset people. Then came the final act. My brother climbed onto the stage and tapped his glass. The room gradually fell silent. A grin spread across his face. The kind that usually meant trouble. "I think it's time," he announced. "My little brother has prepared a wedding toast." Laughter rippled through the ballroom. Guests turned toward me. Some looked amused. Others looked curious. A few clearly expected disaster. The maid of honor looked completely calm. Almost confident. As if she already knew something they didn't. I stood from my chair. The ballroom suddenly felt very quiet. Hundreds of eyes followed me as I walked toward the stage. My brother handed me the microphone with a smug smile. He expected embarrassment. The guest expected entertainment. My family expected another opportunity to laugh. Instead, I smiled, looked around the room, and began speaking. Within seconds, the laughter disappeared. I looked across the ballroom and smiled. Hundreds of faces stared back at me. Some were curious. Some were amused. Most were expecting me to become the evening's final joke. Instead, I raised my glass toward the bride and groom. First, congratulations. Polite applause filled the room. I waited for it to fade. Then I continued. I'd also like to thank my family. That earned several confused looks. My brother's smug expression grew even wider. He clearly thought I was about to praise everyone and sit down. I mean that sincerely, I said. I want to thank every person who told me farming was a mistake. A few laughs appeared around the room. My relatives exchanged amused glances. I kept going. I want to thank everyone who said I was wasting my life. The laughter became quieter. I want to thank the people who told me I'd eventually fail. A strange silence started spreading through the ballroom. My voice remained calm. Every holiday gathering, every family dinner, every joke about dirt, tractors, crops, and bad career decisions gave me something valuable. My brother shifted slightly. The smile on his face was beginning to disappear. It gave me motivation. Nobody laughed this time. The room had finally realized I wasn't telling a joke. I looked around the ballroom. For 10 years I worked 14-hour days. I survived droughts, floods, equipment failures, market crashes, and more than a few disasters caused by my own stupidity. That earned a small chuckle. Even I laughed. But every setback taught me something. The maid of honor watched from her table. Unlike everyone else, she looked proud. I learned that most people quit right before things get better. The room remained completely silent. I learned that success doesn't always wear expensive suits. Several executives suddenly seemed uncomfortable. And I learned that sometimes the people who believe in you the least become the reason you work the hardest. My brother stared at the floor. A few relatives could no longer meet my eyes. For the first time in years, they were seeing the consequences of their own behavior. I wasn't angry. That somehow made it worse. Then, right as I prepared to finish, my pocket started ringing. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom. For half a second nobody moved. Then several guests laughed. Perfect timing. I glanced at the screen. The number immediately caught my attention. Very few people had access to that private line. I'm sorry, I said. I should probably take this. A few more laughs followed. I answered. Hello? The voice on the other end spoke rapidly. My expression changed almost immediately. The representative sounded excited. Extremely excited. Years of negotiations. Months of legal reviews. Countless meetings. Everything had finally been approved. I listened for less than 30 seconds. When the call ended, the ballroom remained silent. Everyone was staring at me. Waiting. My brother looked irritated. Well? He asked. What was so important? I lowered the phone. For a moment I almost laughed. The timing was so ridiculous it felt scripted. Apparently, I said carefully, the land development partnership I've been negotiating was officially approved. Several guests blinked. Nobody seemed to understand. One executive frowned. What kind of partnership? I looked at the message displayed on my screen. Then I read the number. 18 million credits. Silence. Absolute silence. The entire ballroom froze. One woman nearly dropped her glass. My uncle's jaw physically fell open. A cousin choked on his drink. The bride's wealthy father looked as though someone had unplugged his brain. My brother simply stared. 18 million? Somebody whispered. I nodded. The Development Corporation planned to build agricultural infrastructure across several frontier systems using land I controlled. After years of expansion, restoration, and investment, the contract was finally complete. The room remained frozen. Then everything changed. The same uncle who had mocked me during dinner suddenly stood. "I always knew you'd make it." The speed of the transformation was incredible. My cousin immediately nodded. "Absolutely. We were all proud of you." Another relative added. "I kept telling everyone your farm was special." They had not. Not even once. The maid of honor covered her mouth to hide her laughter. I could see her shoulders shaking. She was enjoying this far more than I was. Across the ballroom, guests who had ignored me all evening suddenly wanted my attention. Business cards appeared from nowhere. Smiles became friendlier. Voices became warmer. It was honestly impressive. The entire room had discovered a new personality in less than 10 seconds. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked at the crowd. For years they had seen a failure. One phone call had changed their minds. Not because I had changed. Because a number had. And somehow, that was the funniest part of all. The reception never recovered. Not that I minded. For years I had watched my relatives ignore me. Now they were practically forming a line. One cousin suddenly wanted advice about agricultural investments. An uncle asked whether I was looking for business partners. An aunt who hadn't called me in 3 years informed everyone within hearing distance that we had always been extremely close. The transformation was amazing. If somebody had filmed it as a nature documentary, scientists would have studied it for generations. I escaped the crowd by slipping onto one of the resort's observation balconies. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the transparent walls. For the first time all evening, it was quiet. Almost. A familiar voice spoke behind me. "Congratulations, millionaire." I turned and saw the maid of honor approaching with 2 drinks. I accepted one. "Thanks. You seem surprisingly calm." "I've spent years negotiating that contract." She smiled. "Still, 18 million is impressive." I leaned against the railing. "The funny thing is that nothing actually changed." She laughed. "Your family would disagree. An hour ago they thought I was a failure. And now? They think I'm fascinating." That made her laugh even harder. For several moments we simply stood together, watching the stars. The comfortable silence felt natural. Easy. Far more enjoyable than anything happening inside the ballroom. Eventually she glanced toward me. "You know, I should confess something." "That sounds dangerous." "It probably is." I smiled. She smiled back. "I was impressed by you long before the contract." For a second I wasn't sure what to say. After spending years being dismissed by nearly everyone in my life, hearing those words hit surprisingly hard. "Really?" "Of course." She rolled her eyes. "You restore ecosystems, feed entire settlements, build communities, and somehow remain polite while being surrounded by people who deserve to be launched into space." I laughed so loudly that several guests inside looked toward the balcony. She stepped a little closer. "In my culture, providers are admired." "Providers?" "The people who create things. Farmers. Builders. Protectors." She paused. "Honestly, if my parents hear I spent an evening talking to a successful farmer, they'll probably ask when the wedding is." I nearly spit out my drink. She looked completely serious. That somehow made it even funnier. Before I could answer, the balcony door slid open again. My brother stepped outside. For the first time all night, he looked uncomfortable. The confident executive was gone. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Can we talk?" I exchanged a glance with the maid of honor. She quietly stepped aside. My brother sighed. "I owe you an apology." That alone was shocking enough to qualify as a medical emergency. He looked down. "I spent years making fun of you." "Yes." "I thought you were throwing your future away." "Also yes." He winced. "I was wrong." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I shrugged. It's okay. His head snapped up. That's it. What did you expect? A speech. Maybe some revenge. I laughed. I already got revenge. He looked confused. I pointed toward the ballroom. Half the guests were still trying to figure out how to become my new best friend. My brother finally laughed. A real laugh. Probably the first honest one we'd shared in years. As he headed back inside, the maid of honor returned to my side. That was very mature. I know. It was awful. She smiled and slipped her hand into mine. Neither of us pulled away. The stars reflected in the glass around us while music drifted softly from the reception hall. For once, the future looked surprisingly bright. Not because of the money. The contract was wonderful, but money came and went. What mattered was standing beside someone who had respected me before she knew the size of my bank account. Someone who saw value in hard work instead of status. Inside the ballroom, relatives were still arguing over who had always believed in me. Outside, I had absolutely no interest in joining that conversation. The maid of honor squeezed my hand. So when do I get to see this famous farm? I grinned. Tomorrow. Tomorrow? Assuming you're brave enough. She laughed. Farmer, I survived your family. Your farm can't possibly be scarier. Together we walked away from the balcony and toward whatever came next. Behind us, the richest people in the room continued chasing money. Ahead of us waited open skies, growing fields, and possibilities neither of us had expected when the evening began. It turned out the greatest thing I gained at my brother's wedding wasn't an 18 million credit contract. It was finding the one person in the entire building who valued the dirt on my boots more than the numbers in my account. And that felt like the better deal.